All right, so our last PowerPoint of the year here, the recording, would be market failure number 4, which is the unfair distribution of wealth. All right, so on the left we've got kind of a homeless guy. He's not really kind of, he is a homeless guy. And then on the right we've got Oprah, beautiful Oprah, worth about $2.3 billion. All right, obviously that is fair. So here's some numbers that we're going to look at. Take a look. What percentage of Americans right now are living in poverty? By right now I mean about 2003. All right, we've got about 35.9 million. Numbers a little bit higher ever since the recession. And then the other question that we're going to address is, why is income distribution a market failure? All right, so how we're going to show income distribution is something along the line called the Lorenz curve. All right, and basically what we have to do is measure income distribution. All right, and how they do that, the government divides up all income earning families into 5 equal groups or quintiles, from poorest to richest. All right, and each group represents 20% of the population. And so if there was perfect equity or perfect equality, then 20% of the families should earn 20% of the income, and 40% of the families should earn 40% of the income, and 60% should earn 60%, 80%. That's perfect, right? So that's like a 45-degree angle. All right, and what happens is the government compares how far the actual distribution is from the distribution, from the reality of the whole thing, and then attempts to somewhat redistribute the money fairly. All right, and so how do they measure it? Well, let's say there was $100 floating around the classroom. All right, we would break up into 5 groups, and the group number 1 would be the poorest 20%, and they would have a total of $5. Okay, and that's not $5 per person, that's $5 total. All right, and they would have 5% of the income. The poorest 40%, or the second poorest group, would have a total of $10. All right, and again, that's $10 for that group. All right, and then if we were to measure one more, keep on measuring, the third group, the middle group, would have a total of $15, so 15% of all the income. Right, so remember, we're measuring it in 20% here, but the bottom 20% has only 5% of the total income, and the second 20% only has 10% of the total income, and so on and so forth. Group number 4 would have a total of $25. This would be the 4th richest group. All right, and that 20% would control 25% of the total income. And group number 5, which is the richest 20%, would have a total of $65, or 45% of the total income. And what you've got here, I'm sorry, that should say 65% of the total income. Wow, good job. But in any case, what you've got here is that distribution, that poor distribution of wealth, all right, that the richest 20% controls 65% of the total income. And so what the AP test is going to expect you to know is how to graph that. So we do something called the Lorenz curve. Right, and what the Lorenz curve is as a graph, it's boxed just like this, right, with a 45-degree angle on it. And on the vertical axis, you have the percent of income, and on the horizontal axis, you have the percent of families. And basically what you do is you kind of plug and chug. All right, the perfect equality is that 45%. Okay, and what happens is you're going to measure out. If you take a look down that vertical axis, 5% shows up, and they're going to control 20% of the income. 15% controls that many, so on and so forth, right? And you get this actual distribution that is a curve. A banana, there it is right there. The size of the banana shows the degree of income inequality. The bigger the banana, the bigger the income inequality. The smaller the banana, income inequality. All right? And what happens here is you've got that redistribution. Okay, and you want to go ahead and draw this graph and draw that angle, the actual Lorenz curve out. So go ahead and pause it and get this written down and shade in that area that is yellow before we move forward. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how they redistribute. Right? Oops. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. Progressive, proportional, and regressive, right? A state income that taxes where rich citizens pay higher percent of taxes, that's a progressive tax. 45% on tax, 45 cents on tax on cigarettes. It's actually a regressive tax. It hurts the poor people more. Then you've got a flat tax of Medicare for $1 every year, regardless if you make $1 or $1 million, you're still taxed at that 1%. And then 8.25% California sales tax would also be a regressive tax because that 8.25% is going to hurt you more down the line. All right, take a look at these interest or the table here that represents our current federal income tax. All right, if you're single and you're making between $0 and $830,000 or $8,300, all right, you have a 10% tax. Anything above $372,000, you have to pay 35%. All right, between 33 and 82, you have to pay 25%, 28%, so on and so forth. Okay, is our current system fair? Some say yes, some say no, right? But you have to understand that the progressive tax is the most effective way to fight this market failure. The rich should pay more, the poor should pay less. Remember, market failure is not everybody's being treated equally. So why tax somebody who's not making as much money at a higher proportional rate? All right, and so you have to think about it from that political perspective. Okay, now the last micrograph to learn, the Laffer curve. We've talked about taxes before. All right, we're talking a lot about taxes. What happens when we tax too much? Well, the Laffer curve is going to show us just that. It shows the relationship between the tax rate and tax revenue. Okay, so you have to look at it as if the more we tax, are we going to get more revenue? If we tax less, are we going to get less revenue? So what would happen if the highest tax rate was at 75%? All right, well, you have to think Robin Hood when you think the Laffer curves. Robin Hood, what was his group's name? He was the Merry Men, or the Merry Men. What did they do? They laughed a lot. They were laughers. Get it? This is the lame joke section. What was his weapon of choice? The bow and arrow, because it's a bow. All right. What did Robin Hood do? He stole from the rich and gave to the poor. So what would happen to the amount of travelers through Sherwood Forest if they took 95% of their money instead of 39% of their money? Do you think people would go through Sherwood Forest? Absolutely not. What would happen to the total amount of money he would collect? Well, duh, it would go down. So how specifically? This is the last curve. Here it is. You've got tax revenue on the horizontal axis and tax rate on the vertical axis. If the government increases taxes, tax revenue will increase. The higher the tax rate, the more revenue. Higher the tax rate, the more revenue, and so on and so forth. Right? Until we get to a point where there really will be no incentive to work harder because everything's just going to get taken away in taxes. And so the higher the tax rate goes, the lower the tax revenue, because what's the incentive to make more money? I'm not going to make more money because the government's just going to take it away from me, and that's not cool. All right, so make sure you understand the relationship that as the tax revenue